The late afternoon sun cut sharply through the high, reinforced windows of Greystone's visiting room. Daniel Hartman sat rigidly at the metal table, hands folded neatly in front of him. Across from him, Evan chatted animatedly, clearly overjoyed to have his father finally meet Marissa Blake, the woman he planned to marry next spring. Marissa was polite, attentive, and calm. She listened intently to Daniel, answering his skeptical questions with poise. She was in her early 20s, with delicate features and a soft voice, speaking about her work at a local veterinary clinic and her dreams for a small family in a quiet town. Yet, beneath Daniel's cordial exterior, an unshakable sense of unease gnawed at him. There was something in the way Marissa avoided certain topics, family, childhood, early schooling, that stirred a latent suspicion honed by years in prison. After the visit ended, Daniel lay awake that night in his cell, replaying every word, every glance. Years behind bars had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. He decided he would write to Evan later in the week, pressing more about Marissa's background, but carefully. He couldn't afford to push his son away again after working so hard to rebuild trust. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Evan remained oblivious to the storm brewing. For Evan, the upcoming marriage was a bridge back to normalcy, a symbol that life could still be full of hope. For Daniel, it was the beginning of an unraveling. What none of them knew was that within a matter of weeks, a single discovery inside these grim walls would explode into violence so irreversible that it would shatter what little family they had left. In the days following the visit, Daniel became restless. Conversations in the yard with other inmates blurred into meaningless noise. His mind kept circling back to Marissa, the careful pauses before answering certain questions, the slight tension in her shoulders when Evan mentioned her family. Daniel had lived among liars and mask wearers for too long not to recognize when something didn't add up. One evening, sitting at a cracked metal table in the prison library, Daniel decided to act. Access to outside information was limited, but sometimes favors could be called in. He approached an older inmate named Ricky Morales, a man who had contacts outside who could sometimes get information for the right price. Daniel offered to trade a few of his commissary privileges for a simple background check. Marissa Blake, 24, from Ashton, works at a veterinary clinic. It would take a few weeks, Morales warned. Daniel accepted grimly. He had patience. Prison had beaten that into him long ago. Meanwhile, Evan continued visiting every Saturday afternoon, brimming with excitement over wedding plans. He spoke of a small ceremony next spring and moving into a modest house Marissa had found near the town's outskirts. He beamed when he showed Daniel a worn photo of Marissa holding a rescue dog, her expression warm, almost maternal. Daniel smiled thinly, stuffing down the ugly tension twisting in his gut. Every fiber of him wanted to protect his son, but protect him from what exactly? A vague feeling wasn't enough. He needed proof, or he needed to silence the doubts before they poisoned everything again. The weeks dragged on. Daniel found himself withdrawing from old prison routines. He snapped at fellow inmates and grew more curt with guards. Even in his hardened world, Daniel was known for a certain discipline, a control that now seemed to be fraying thread by thread. Finally, one rainy Thursday evening, Morales slid into a seat across from Daniel during dinner. Without a word, he pushed a folded piece of paper across the scratched plastic table. Daniel waited until lights out to unfold it under the weak glow of his bunk lamp. The information was thin but devastating. Marissa Blake had been born Martin Blake in a small neighboring county and had legally transitioned 4 years ago after moving to Ashton. The name change had been processed quietly, without fanfare, but it left a paper trail for those who knew where to look. Daniel stared at the words, his breathing growing shallow. His hands trembled, a foreign sensation for a man who once prided himself on his unbreakable composure. Everything inside him, the culture he was raised in, the violent instincts he had spent years trying to leash, roared to the surface. He thought of Evan, innocent, idealistic, oblivious. He thought of the wedding invitations, the family dinners, the future grandchildren that Evan had spoken about with shining eyes. The betrayal, as Daniel saw it, was total. And the next time Marissa visited, Daniel vowed silently, there would be no more polite conversations. There would be no forgiveness. The morning of the next visit dawned overcast and cold. Greystone's yard was slick with rainwater, and the halls echoed with the hollow clang of metal doors. Daniel sat rigidly on his bunk, hands clenched into fists against his knees, rehearsing in his mind what he would say, what he could say. He didn't know if Evan knew. That thought gnawed at him more viciously than anything else. If Evan was ignorant, Daniel could still save him. If Evan knew and accepted, it meant Daniel had lost his son in ways he couldn't begin to accept. A guard's voice crackled outside the cell door, pulling Daniel from his spiraling thoughts. "Hartman, you got a visit." Daniel rose slowly, breathing deep, forcing the rage into a cold, manageable place inside him. Years of survival had taught him never to show his hand too soon. The visiting room buzzed with low conversation as Daniel entered. His eyes scanned the tables until he saw them. Evan, waving eagerly, Marissa at his side. She wore a simple blue sweater, her hair pulled back neatly. She smiled when their eyes met. Daniel's stomach twisted. He forced a tight-lipped smile and made his way over. For a few minutes, the conversation was painfully ordinary. Evan shared stories about the house they hoped to rent. Marissa spoke about adopting another dog. Daniel nodded where appropriate, but his mind was elsewhere, cataloging every nervous glance Marissa made, every slight catch in her voice. Finally, when Evan excused himself to use the restroom, leaving Daniel and Marissa alone, the tension between them thickened palpably. Daniel leaned across the table, his voice low, dangerous. "I know what you are," he said, barely above a whisper. Marissa stiffened, color draining from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but Daniel raised a hand, stopping her cold. "You lied to him. You lied to me." Marissa's lips trembled, but she kept her voice even. "I didn't lie. I wanted him to know me as I am now, not who I was." Daniel's fists curled under the table. "You tricked him into thinking he had a normal life ahead of him," Daniel hissed, bitterness seeping into every word. "You made a fool out of my son." Marissa's voice broke slightly. "He knows, Mr. Hartman. Evan knows, and he loves me. He accepts me. That's all that matters." Daniel's vision tunneled. The buzz of the room faded until it was just the two of them, locked in an invisible war. He wanted to explode, to shout, to tear the table in two, but he didn't. Not yet. Not here. Instead, he stood abruptly, causing the nearby guard to glance over warily. "I'll see you both next week," Daniel said, his voice clipped and unreadable. He turned and left without another word, his boots echoing down the concrete hallway. Back in his cell, Daniel lay staring at the cracked ceiling for hours, the rage inside him simmering to a dangerous boil. Evan knew. Evan had known all along. And worse, he had chosen Marissa anyway, chosen her over everything Daniel believed to be right, to be natural, to be acceptable. In Daniel's mind, it was no longer a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was a betrayal, and betrayals demanded consequences. In the days following the confrontation, Daniel's behavior grew erratic. Guards noted his agitation. Fellow inmates gave him a wider berth. He snapped at minor inconveniences, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white at mealtimes, and spent long stretches pacing the yard like a caged animal. Even the warden, a typically detached man, remarked to the prison counselor that Daniel Hartman was winding up like a coiled spring. Inside Daniel's mind, the world narrowed to a single burning point: Marissa. She had infiltrated his son's life, warped it beyond recognition, and stood to cement that betrayal permanently through marriage. Daniel felt cornered, powerless behind prison walls, but his mind latched onto a grim conclusion. As long as Marissa lived, Evan would remain lost to him. Daniel found himself rehearsing scenarios late into the night. Confrontations, interventions, warnings. But every imagined conversation ended the same way, in violence. He knew his options were limited. He couldn't reach Evan from behind these walls in any meaningful way. But Marissa came into the prison, came into his world, under the illusion of safety. And Daniel still had power here. Meanwhile, Evan remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just out of sight. He continued to send cheerful letters, updating Daniel on wedding arrangements, sharing photographs of him and Marissa smiling together, oblivious to the fact that each envelope deepened his father's festering sense of betrayal. The next visit was scheduled for the following Saturday. Daniel spent the intervening days preparing himself, not physically, but mentally. He meditated not on calming down, but on sealing off his humanity, brick by brick, until nothing but purpose remained. Years of prison life had taught him one vital lesson. When you decided to act, hesitation was the enemy. He managed to secure a small, sharpened piece of plastic, a makeshift weapon, through a favor called in from a desperate inmate he'd once protected. Daniel hid it expertly in the waistband of his jumpsuit, knowing the pat-downs before visiting sessions were cursory at best, intended to catch contraband from visitors, not inmates. Friday night arrived, and Daniel sat in the darkness of his cell, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Evan's smile as a child, the way he used to run into Daniel's arms after school. He thought of how prison had stripped him of fatherhood, and how now, even the hope of reconciliation was being ripped away by the hands of someone Daniel saw as a fraud. By morning, Daniel had made peace with what he planned to do. He wasn't saving Evan's future anymore. He was avenging the past Saturday morning at Greystone Correctional Facility began like any other. Routine counts, the metallic clatter of breakfast trays, guards shouting roll calls. For Daniel, however, everything moved as if underwater, each moment pulling him inexorably closer to an inevitable outcome. The call for visitation came mid-morning. Daniel dressed carefully in his state-issued uniform, adjusting the hidden blade so it lay flat against the curve of his lower back. He passed through the pat-down without incident. The guards, familiar with his usually disciplined behavior, found no reason to suspect him. The visiting room hummed with low conversations and the scraping of chairs. Families reunited briefly across scratched metal tables, exchanging hurried words and touches, pretending for a few precious hours that the prison walls didn't exist. Daniel spotted Evan immediately, standing near the check-in area, laughing about something Marissa had said. Evan's face lit up when he saw his father. He waved them over to their usual table in the far corner, slightly isolated from the others. Daniel walked toward them, his heartbeat slow, methodical. The weapon against his back felt cold, almost comforting now. Marissa smiled at him warmly, perhaps mistaking his grim expression for residual distrust, instead of the lethal intent simmering underneath. They sat. Evan launched into a story about the bakery Marissa had chosen for their wedding cake. Marissa laughed, teasing Evan about his terrible taste in desserts. Daniel nodded mechanically, pretending to listen. His gaze, however, never left Marissa. Minutes stretched painfully long. Daniel's hands remained flat on the table, the blade hidden, the opportunity not yet ripe. A guard stationed by the entrance yawned and turned to speak to a colleague. Visitors shifted in their chairs, creating a momentary distraction. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It would have to be now, or not at all. He shifted slightly, preparing to act, but Evan, oblivious, leaned forward, pulling something from his jacket pocket. A photo, one Daniel hadn't seen before. It was of Evan and Marissa at a small lake, standing together under a bright, cloudless sky. Evan's arm was slung protectively around Marissa's shoulders, their smiles wide, genuine. "We're thinking of getting married here," Evan said, pushing the photo toward Daniel. His voice was filled with hope, pride. "It's peaceful. It feels like a new beginning, you know?" Daniel stared at the image, the blood pounding in his ears. A new beginning. For Evan, yes. For Daniel, there was no such thing. He swallowed hard, his vision swimming between the present and memories of a boy he had once cradled in his arms. A boy who used to believe his father could fix anything that went wrong. For a fleeting second, Daniel hesitated, but it was only a second. In his mind, he had already crossed the point of no return. As Evan tucked the photo back into his jacket, chatting animatedly about wedding details, Daniel made a decision. It would happen today. It would happen soon. And nothing Evan said or did would change it now. The visiting room's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold pallor over the room. Daniel's hands rested motionless on the table, his breathing steady, controlled. Across from him, Evan chattered animatedly about wedding invitations, oblivious to the tension building just beneath the surface. Marissa, too, seemed relaxed, though she occasionally shot Daniel small, cautious glances, perhaps sensing the coldness in his eyes, the stiffness in his posture. She mistook it for lingering resentment. She had no idea how close she was to something far worse. The guard by the door was distracted, laughing at a joke shared with a fellow officer. Other inmates and visitors were lost in their own moments, tears, smiles, quiet conversations. No one was watching closely. Daniel's opportunity was coming into focus. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the handle of the improvised blade dig into his back. His mind played through the steps, leaned forward as if to speak, bring his hand up fast, strike hard. Marissa wouldn't even have time to react. Evan's voice broke through Daniel's rehearsed violence. "Dad," Evan said, his tone softer now. I know it's a lot to take in, about Marissa, about everything. I just want you to know you're still my family, no matter what." Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Evan's sincerity was raw, palpable. He wasn't trying to provoke. He wasn't pleading. He was simply offering unconditional love, oblivious to the storm brewing less than a foot away. Marissa reached across the table and gently squeezed Evan's hand. Daniel's jaw tightened. In his mind, the act was intolerable. An open defiance of everything he had taught his son, everything he believed in. The small, intimate gesture between them felt like the final insult. There would be no more hesitations. The conversation drifted again, Evan mentioning a small celebration they planned to hold after the wedding at a friend's house. Daniel listened with half an ear, his focus narrowing, his body tensing for the moment to strike. Suddenly, Marissa excused herself politely to use the restroom, leaving Evan and Daniel alone at the table. Daniel's fingers twitched. This wasn't ideal. He had planned to do it in front of Evan, force him to see the truth, force him to understand. But with Marissa walking away, Daniel realized he could not afford to lose the chance. He rose quietly from the table. Evan looked up in mild confusion. "Dad?" Daniel forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just going to stretch my legs." Without waiting for a response, he followed the narrow corridor that led to the restrooms. His footsteps were silent, his heart hammering with cold purpose. At the far end of the corridor, Marissa stood at the sink, washing her hands, oblivious. The corridor was momentarily empty. No guards, no visitors. Daniel's hand slipped to the weapon tucked at his back. It was time. The corridor felt impossibly narrow as Daniel moved down it, every step deliberate, every breath measured. The noise of the visiting room faded behind him, replaced by the hollow echo of his boots on the scuffed linoleum floor. At the end of the hall, Marissa stood at the sink, adjusting her hair in the cracked mirror, unaware that danger was approaching from behind. Daniel closed the distance quickly. When he was just a few steps away, Marissa caught sight of him in the mirror. Their eyes met, hers widening in recognition and confusion. For half a second, she smiled, as if expecting another difficult but civil conversation. Daniel didn't speak. He lunged. The makeshift blade, a sharpened piece of melted plastic and metal shank, slipped from his sleeve into his hand with practiced ease. His arm swung forward in a brutal, practiced motion honed by years inside. The first strike hit just below Marissa's collarbone. She gasped, a wet, guttural sound, staggering backward into the sink. Blood blossomed across her sweater, startlingly bright against the blue fabric. She opened her mouth to scream, but Daniel struck again, this time aiming higher. The weapon sank into her neck, silencing her almost instantly. Her body crumpled to the floor with a sickening thud, her legs folding awkwardly beneath her. She made a choking noise, tried weakly to crawl, to reach for something, help, stability, life, but it was too late. Daniel stood over her, breathing heavily, the weapon slick with blood in his hand. The world had gone deathly silent. For a few long, terrible seconds, it was only him, Marissa, and the spreading pool of red on the floor. A shout broke the spell. One of the guards, too far away to have seen the attack, but close enough now to recognize that something was wrong. Daniel turned, his expression blank, weapon still in hand. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. Metal clattered as a baton was drawn. Commands were shouted, loud and meaningless to Daniel's ears. He dropped the weapon without resistance, letting it clatter to the floor beside Marissa's motionless body. As guards tackled him to the ground, slamming his face against the dirty linoleum, Daniel barely struggled. His mind was oddly calm, almost serene. He had done what he came to do. The rest, punishment, isolation, death, was secondary. In the confusion, Evan ran toward the corridor, his face contorted in horror. It took 2 guards to hold him back. "Dad, what did you do?" Evan screamed, his voice cracking into a raw, broken sob. But Daniel didn't answer. He was already gone in every way that mattered. Within minutes of the attack, Greystone Correctional Facility erupted into chaos. A full lockdown was initiated. Alarms blared through the concrete halls, heavy metal doors slammed shut, and visitors were herded out of the building under panicked orders. Emergency medical staff sprinted to the corridor, but it was a formality. Marissa was already gone. A single glance at the spreading crimson stain beneath her body confirmed that no amount of CPR or defibrillation could bring her back. A white sheet was eventually drawn over her, a hollow ritual of dignity that came too late. Daniel lay face down in handcuffs, an officer's knee grinding into his back. He offered no resistance, no explanation. His eyes were blank, staring at nothing. Evan, meanwhile, struggled violently against 2 guards trying to hold him back. His sobs echoed through the sterile hallway. "Why? Why did you do this?" Evan shouted hoarsely at his father, but Daniel gave no sign he even heard him. Warden Prescott arrived within 15 minutes, surveying the scene with a grim face. He barked orders to secure Daniel in solitary confinement immediately. Staff scrambled to document the crime scene, taking hurried photographs and placing numbered evidence markers around the bloody corridor. An internal affairs investigator, already on site for an unrelated inspection, took over preliminary interviews. Witness statements were gathered. A few visitors had noticed Daniel leaving the table, but no one saw the attack itself until it was too late. CCTV footage was pulled from the hallway's only security camera, an aging unit mounted at a poor angle that captured only fragments. Daniel following Marissa down the hall, the struggle, the collapse. It was enough. Meanwhile, Evan was escorted to a private room, trembling, barely able to stand. A counselor tried to speak to him, but Evan sat mute, staring blankly at the floor, clutching the photo he had shown his father just an hour earlier. The prison's atmosphere, already tense on good days, shifted palpably. Inmates whispered furiously about the killing. Guards moved with heightened alertness, knowing any major incident could tip the volatile balance of prison life into chaos. Back in solitary, Daniel sat on the thin mattress, staring at the wall. He neither asked for a lawyer nor responded to the guards' questions. He showed no reaction when informed he would be charged with first-degree murder. In his mind, the act was complete, final, irrevocable. In Evan's mind, the act was something else entirely, a shattering of his last ties to the man he once called father. Outside the prison, news of the killing began leaking to local media. Reporters swarmed the gates, eager for any scraps of information about the killing that had happened inside what was supposed to be a controlled environment. The story had only begun. The damage, however, was already permanent. Detectives from the county sheriff's office arrived at Greystone by early evening. Detective Laura Kincaid and Detective Marcus Bell, both seasoned investigators, were assigned to handle the case. They reviewed the preliminary internal reports, the limited security footage, and the scant witness statements. It was already clear this would not be a complicated investigation in terms of identifying the killer. Daniel Hartman had been caught red-handed, weapon still dripping in his hand. The complexity would lie elsewhere: motive, systemic failures, and the fallout. The first priority was interviewing Evan. Evan sat hunched in a small, windowless interview room inside the prison's administration wing. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he clutched a disposable cup of water he hadn't touched. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed by shock and disbelief. Detective Kincaid entered quietly, sitting across from him with a gentle, non-threatening posture. Bell stood by the door, arms crossed. "Evan," Kincaid began softly, "we know this is incredibly difficult, but we need your help to understand what happened today." Evan nodded numbly. "Did your father ever express hostility toward Marissa before today?" she asked carefully. Evan hesitated, swallowing hard. He wasn't thrilled about us getting married, Evan finally said, his voice cracking. But I thought he was just struggling to accept things. I thought with time he'd come around. Did he ever threaten Marissa? Say anything to make you fear for her safety? No. Evan shook his head emphatically. Never. He was cold sometimes, but not violent. I never thought he would. His voice broke off into a choked sob. Kincaid let the silence stretch, allowing Evan space to gather himself. Did Marissa tell you about any conversations she had with your father during visits? Kincaid asked gently. Evan wiped his eyes, sniffling. She said he was tense. She thought he just needed more time. She said she didn't want to make me choose between them. Evan's face crumpled with guilt. I never thought he'd do this. I never thought... Kincaid nodded sympathetically, but inside she was already sketching the profile. Daniel Hartman, middle-aged, long-term inmate, a man shaped by prison culture, likely harboring rigid beliefs about gender and identity. To him, Marissa's existence might have been seen as a betrayal, not just by her, but by Evan as well. Bell stepped forward. Did your father know about Marissa's past before today? Evan hesitated. I think... maybe. I don't know how. We didn't hide it. Marissa was honest with me from the beginning. I thought... it didn't matter. Neither detective corrected him. They finished the interview gently, leaving Evan in the care of a prison counselor afterward. As they walked back through the institutional hallways, Bell muttered under his breath, "That kid's never going to recover from this." Kincaid said nothing. She agreed. Meanwhile, Daniel Hartman sat alone in solitary confinement, refusing food, refusing conversation. When the prison psychologist attempted an evaluation, Daniel stared blankly through him, offering no insight, no remorse, no explanation. For Daniel, the act had been simple, justified in a way that words could not or would not convey. For everyone else, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would only deepen with time. Outside, protests began to form at the prison gates. Some decried the killing as a hate crime. Others demanded answers about how a prisoner had managed to conceal a weapon and carry out a murder in a secured facility. The public wanted someone to blame. Soon, they would have plenty. 2 days after the killing, Daniel Hartman was officially charged with first-degree murder. A special arraignment was hastily organized at the county courthouse under tight security. Daniel would appear by video feed from the prison's administrative wing, a decision made to prevent any chance of further violence or disruption. The charge sheet was blunt. Premeditated murder committed during a supervised visitation inside a state correctional facility. Prosecutors wasted no time framing the crime as particularly heinous, citing its setting, motive, and utter lack of remorse. They made it clear early on that they intended to seek the maximum sentence available. Even though Daniel was already serving a long-term sentence, the symbolism mattered. Justice had to be seen to be done. The press swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Evan arrived to give a brief statement, despite barely being able to stand upright. His lawyer advised him to speak simply, and Evan's voice trembled as he faced the microphones. "Marissa was the kindest, bravest person I ever knew," he said, his voice raw. "She deserved love and happiness, not violence. I will spend the rest of my life honoring her." He didn't mention his father's name. Inside his apartment that night, Evan sat alone, surrounded by the remnants of a future that would never be. Wedding invitations stacked on the table, framed engagement photos leaning against the wall, Marissa's favorite coffee mug still sitting in the sink. Every object seemed to hum with the painful finality of her absence. Across town, protests grew louder. Signs reading "Justice for Marissa," "End prison violence," and "Protect trans lives" lined the streets. Commentators on the evening news debated heatedly. Was this solely the act of a violent man shaped by prison? Or was it fueled by deeper social prejudices ignored for too long? Inside Greystone, administrators launched an internal review under immense public pressure. How had Daniel Hartman obtained a weapon? Why hadn't a guard noticed him following Marissa? Why were blind spots allowed in visitor corridors? No one wanted to admit what everyone feared. Prisons weren't fortresses. They were brittle systems, stretched thin and prone to catastrophic failures. Meanwhile, Daniel remained in solitary confinement, his days blending into one another without distinction. He ate little, spoke less, and stared at the walls like a man already dead. When a court-appointed defense attorney tried to discuss strategy with him, Daniel barely acknowledged her. "You're facing the death penalty if they push for it," she warned, voice low. Daniel simply shrugged. It was clear he didn't care about legal outcomes. In his mind, his task was finished. What happened next was meaningless. The only sign of any remaining emotion came one night when a guard overheard Daniel muttering a few ragged words in the dark. "He was supposed to be mine," Daniel said, almost too quietly to hear. "Not hers." The words were reported, noted in the case file, but they did little to illuminate a motive already all too visible. Daniel hadn't simply killed Marissa, he had destroyed his son. And that, in many ways, was the deeper crime, one that no prison sentence could ever undo. As formal preparations for trial began, the pressure on all sides intensified. The prison's internal review findings were leaked to the press. The report was damning: insufficient security protocols during visitation, undertrained staff, and a surveillance system riddled with blind spots. Worse, it emerged that a guard assigned to the visitation wing that day had previously filed a complaint about being overworked, and it had been ignored. The public outrage, already high, exploded. Protesters demanded the warden's resignation. Civil rights organizations called for a federal investigation into systemic failures at Greystone. The narrative shifted slightly. While Daniel Hartman remained the killer, the system itself was now seen as a secondary accomplice. Inside the walls of Greystone, Daniel seemed untouched by the storm raging outside. When his attorney, Rachel Leonard, attempted to discuss defense strategies with him again, Daniel remained silent for most of the meeting. Only once did he speak, his voice flat. "There's no defense. I did what I had to do." Rachel pushed back, explaining the concept of diminished capacity, arguing they might avoid a death sentence if they could show he acted under extreme emotional disturbance. Daniel didn't even blink. It was clear. He had no interest in saving himself. Meanwhile, Evan faced growing pressure from prosecutors. They wanted him to testify at trial, to paint a full picture of Marissa's life, of her honesty, of the dreams she and Evan had shared. They needed to humanize Marissa, to drive home the full weight of the loss Daniel had inflicted. But Evan hesitated. Each time he thought about stepping into a courtroom, seeing his father sitting there, it made his stomach turn. Every memory was tainted now. Christmas mornings, baseball games, every fragile moment of their repaired relationship, all poisoned. At night, Evan couldn't sleep. He replayed every conversation he'd ever had with Daniel over the past year, searching for signs he might have missed, clues that could have warned him. He found none. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. If he hadn't insisted on reconnecting, hadn't pushed Marissa to visit, hadn't clung so desperately to the idea of family, would she still be alive? Friends urged him to testify, to honor Marissa's memory. But facing his father in court felt like ripping open wounds that might never heal. The prosecution set a deadline. They needed a decision soon. Outside, the case became a media circus. Commentators debated endlessly on cable news. Was this a hate crime? Was it prison negligence? Could Daniel even be deemed legally sane after so many years behind bars? The question of Daniel's mental competency loomed larger. Prosecutors ordered a formal psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Charles Heller, a veteran forensic psychologist, was brought in to assess Daniel. The sessions were painstaking. Dr. Heller found Daniel lucid, coherent, and fully aware of his actions. He showed no psychosis, no disorganized thought patterns. His emotional flatness, Heller noted, stemmed not from mental illness, but from years of hardened survival mechanisms and deeply ingrained personal ideology. In short, Daniel Hartman was not insane. He was simply broken. The report concluded that Daniel was fit to stand trial, and so, preparations continued. 2 lives destroyed, 1 death, and no possibility of redemption for anyone involved. The trial began on a bitterly cold Monday morning in early March. Dozens of protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their breath visible in the air, clutching signs that demanded justice for Marissa Blake and sweeping reforms in prison oversight. News vans lined the curb, cameras broadcasting live coverage as spectators crowded the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom was a pressure cooker of tension. The public gallery was filled with Marissa's friends, LGBTQ+ advocates, reporters, and a handful of prison officials under scrutiny. Evan sat quietly near the front, flanked by Marissa's sister, Allison Blake, who held his hand tightly throughout. Daniel Hartman was brought in under heavy guard, shackled at the wrists and ankles. He wore a drab prison jumpsuit, his face impassive, betraying no emotion as he was led to the defense table. Judge Ronald Weaver, a stern man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, presided over the proceedings. After a brief review of preliminary motions, the jury, carefully selected from a pool screened for bias, was ushered into the courtroom. Opening statements began. Prosecutor Angela Ruiz stood, projecting calm authority as she addressed the jury. Marissa Blake was a young woman who deserved a future, she began. She was a daughter, a fiancée, a friend. She trusted in the basic decency of those around her, including the father of the man she loved. Ruiz's voice sharpened. Daniel Hartman betrayed that trust in the most brutal way possible. He stalked Marissa Blake inside a facility where she should have been safe. He planned this attack. He concealed a weapon. He waited for his opportunity. And then, without provocation, he took her life. Ruiz painted Daniel's actions as deliberate and premeditated, rooted not in temporary madness, but in a cold ideology, a belief that Marissa's very existence was a betrayal that had to be erased. When Ruiz finished, Rachel Leonard, Daniel's court-appointed attorney, rose. Her defense was spare. There is no question that Mr. Hartman killed Marissa Blake. The evidence will show that clearly, Leonard said. What you must decide is whether this crime stemmed from a place of irrational fear, deep emotional disturbance, and a life of institutionalization that distorted his ability to function in normal society. It was a thin defense, aimed not at exoneration but mitigation. The prosecution's first witnesses were prison staff. A corrections officer described seeing Daniel leave his seat and head toward the corridor, but admitted he failed to intervene. Another detailed the discovery of the makeshift weapon, a plastic shank sharpened from melted utensils, smuggled past standard security measures. Surveillance footage was played, grainy, partial, chilling. The jury watched as Daniel followed Marissa into the blind corridor, saw the brief, violent struggle, saw Marissa collapse. The gallery sat in horrified silence. Evan was scheduled to testify the next day. That night, Evan lay awake in his darkened apartment, staring at the ceiling. Testifying meant reliving everything: the visits, the growing hope, the final conversation, the realization that trust had cost Marissa her life. He gripped a framed photo of Marissa, taken at the lake where they had planned to marry. "I have to," he whispered into the silence. He wasn't doing it to punish his father. He was doing it to give Marissa a voice in a courtroom where she would otherwise be reduced to a victim in a file folder. He had made his decision. Tomorrow, he would face Daniel in court, and he would speak. The second day of the trial began under gray skies. A light drizzle slicked the courthouse steps, mirroring the somber mood inside. Evan Hartman sat rigidly in the witness box, wearing a simple black suit. His hands trembled slightly as he swore the oath, his voice barely audible. Prosecutor Angela Ruiz approached with careful, deliberate steps. "Evan," she began softly, "can you tell us about Marissa Blake? About the kind of person she was?" Evan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak. "She was kind," he said, voice breaking immediately. He paused, taking a shallow breath. "She was patient. She loved animals, loved helping people. She made everything feel lighter." His eyes flickered briefly across the courtroom, just once, to where Daniel sat, shackled and expressionless. "She was honest with me from the beginning," Evan continued, his voice gaining strength. "She trusted me with her whole truth, and I loved her for it, not despite it, because of it." Ruiz nodded encouragingly. "Did your father ever express his feelings about Marissa to you?" Evan hesitated. "He was distant," Evan admitted. "Cold. I knew he didn't approve, but he never said anything violent. I thought he'd come around." Ruiz's face was grave. "Did Marissa ever express concerns about her safety during visits?" No, Evans said quickly, emotion rushing into his voice. She wanted to believe he could change. She thought, if we showed him love, he'd find a way to accept it. The courtroom remained utterly still. Evan, Ruiz asked gently, how has Marissa's death affected you? Evan's composure cracked completely then. Tears streamed freely down his face, his words choked by sobs. She was my future, he gasped. She was my family, and he took her away. He didn't just kill her, he killed everything we were building. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jurors looked down at their laps, visibly uncomfortable. Judge Weaver allowed a short recess to give Evan time to compose himself. In the gallery, Allison Blake sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every raw detail for the evening headlines. During the break, Daniel sat motionless. He made no effort to look at Evan. No reaction flickered across his face. Not regret, not anger, not even recognition. It was as if Evan's grief, his pain, belonged to another life entirely, one Daniel had already abandoned. When court resumed, cross-examination was mercifully brief. Rachel Leonard, tasked with defending the indefensible, asked only a few basic questions about Daniel's incarceration and Evan's efforts to rebuild a relationship. She did not attack Evan's character. She didn't dare. As Evan stepped down from the witness stand, he avoided looking at his father. His body shook with barely suppressed emotion, but he moved steadily, refusing to collapse under the weight of it all. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed him for comments. He said nothing. Inside, the trial moved forward, but something had shifted. The jury had seen Evan's grief firsthand, had felt the raw, open wound left by Daniel's actions. The prosecution's case was no longer just about facts. It was about faces, about loss, and the face of that loss sat broken and silent in the front row every day. Daniel remained detached, isolated in his own cold world. But around him, a society demanded answers, and increasingly demanded punishment. After Evan's testimony, the prosecution moved swiftly to solidify their case. They brought in expert witnesses. A forensic psychologist explained how Daniel's background and prison environment might have hardened his prejudices, but made clear that hatred, not mental illness, drove his actions. A prison security consultant detailed the chain of failures that allowed Daniel to move freely, but emphasized that the murder was ultimately a deliberate choice. Each witness hammered home the same theme. Daniel Hartman acted with full awareness. He planned, he waited, he killed. By the end of the week, prosecutor Angela Ruiz stood to deliver her closing argument. She paced slowly before the jury box, hands clasped behind her back, her voice calm but edged with steel. This case is about a choice, she said. Daniel Hartman chose to end a life. He chose to respond to honesty, love, and acceptance with hatred and violence. She pointed gently toward Evan, who sat in the gallery, his hands clutched tightly in his lap. Look at the cost of that choice. Look at the son left alone. Look at the family that will never see their daughter again. Ruiz finished by holding up a photograph of Marissa Blake, the same smiling photo Evan had once shown Daniel in the visiting room. She deserved better than to die on a prison floor. You have the power to speak for her now, to say that hatred has no place in justice. She sat down without further dramatics. Rachel Leonard rose slowly for the defense's closing argument. She looked tired, almost apologetic. We do not excuse what happened, Leonard began, her voice steady. But we ask you to understand the life that shaped Daniel Hartman, a man locked away for decades, shaped by violence, distrust, and fear, a man who was never given the tools to heal. She asked the jury to consider life imprisonment without parole rather than the death penalty, arguing that vengeance would not undo the damage already done. But her words felt small in the cavernous courtroom, dwarfed by the enormity of the crime. When Leonard sat down, a heavy silence filled the room. Judge Weaver issued final instructions to the jury. Consider the evidence carefully, weigh the intent, and deliberate without bias or emotion clouding the law. But everyone knew, emotion had already entered the courtroom. The jurors were dismissed to deliberate. Outside, the courthouse steps were a maelstrom of noise. Protesters chanting, cameras flashing, reporters speculating about the outcome. Inside a small holding room, Daniel sat alone, staring at the floor. Evan, meanwhile, waited upstairs with Allison Blake and a few close friends. He barely spoke, numb with exhaustion and dread. There was no winning here. Even a guilty verdict wouldn't bring Marissa back. But maybe, just maybe, it would offer a sliver of acknowledgement that what happened to her mattered, that her life had weight, that her death had consequences. The jury retired to deliberate. Everyone waited, and the clock began its slow, relentless march toward a verdict. The jury deliberated for 9 tense hours over 2 days. Throughout, the courthouse buzzed with nervous anticipation. Television crews camped on the steps, endlessly repeating details of the trial and speculating about the outcome. Protesters chanted outside, their voices carrying up to the courtroom windows. Inside a small waiting room, Evan sat alongside Allison Blake, quiet and withdrawn. Sleep had evaded him for days, leaving dark circles beneath hollow eyes. He flinched at every knock on the door, every hallway whisper, waiting, always waiting, for a resolution. Finally, just before noon on the second day, word arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom quickly filled again, tense and solemn. Daniel was led back inside, shackled and emotionless, showing no sign he understood or cared about what would happen next. Judge Weaver instructed everyone to rise as the jurors filed in, their faces grave and unreadable. When the foreperson stood, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Hartman, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom murmured briefly, then fell silent again. Evan's shoulders shook slightly, relief mingling with grief in a confusing wave. Allison squeezed his hand gently. Across the aisle, Daniel stared forward blankly, unmoved by his own condemnation. Judge Weaver thanked the jury and immediately announced sentencing would occur the following morning. Outside, Evan gave a brief, trembling statement to the gathered media. "Justice doesn't heal the wounds," he said quietly. But at least today, Marissa's life mattered to this courtroom. She deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. She deserved better than the hate she faced. That night, alone in his cell awaiting sentencing, Daniel sat motionless. Guards noted he refused dinner, responding to questions with only vacant silence. Early the next morning, the courtroom filled again. Daniel appeared, unchanged in demeanor. Evan sat quietly in the front row, watching his father closely for any sign. Regret, anger, anything. Nothing came. Judge Weaver addressed Daniel sternly before sentencing. "Mr. Hartman, your actions showed a profound disregard for human life and dignity. You extinguished not only a promising life, but inflicted irreparable emotional harm on those closest to you." The judge paused briefly, the silence heavy. "You leave this court no choice. Daniel Hartman, I sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole." Gasps and quiet murmurs filled the courtroom momentarily. Daniel gave no visible reaction. It was as though the words meant nothing to him, just noise in an empty space. As Daniel was escorted from the courtroom, Evan rose slowly, watching his father's back recede through the door, disappearing into the prison system forever. There was no catharsis, no closure, only emptiness. Outside, the crowd dispersed slowly, still carrying signs honoring Marissa and demanding prison reforms. The case was officially over, but the damage would linger indefinitely, scars invisible but profound. Evan stood on the courthouse steps, breathing cold, bitter air into exhausted lungs, haunted by a question he knew would never be answered. Could any form of justice ever truly heal a wound this deep? In the days following the trial, the media frenzy continued, with news outlets discussing Daniel's sentencing and the growing calls for prison reform. The injustice of the killing, carried out in a supposedly secure facility, was not lost on the public. Greystone Correctional Facility faced increased scrutiny, and calls for accountability went beyond just Daniel Hartman's actions. Politicians, civil rights groups, and journalists were all asking the same question. How could such a murder occur behind bars, and what needed to change to prevent further violence? But for Evan, the public outrage felt distant, irrelevant. Each morning he woke up, the weight of the past few weeks still pressing down on him. The courtroom, his testimony, the verdict, none of it brought his life with Marissa back. He couldn't escape the image of her face when she'd told him about their future, the plans they'd made, the love they shared. Her absence gnawed at him every hour of every day. Evan spent his nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the emotions that suffocated him. Guilt, grief, anger. He felt as though he were drowning in it. He couldn't help but question everything. Had he missed the signs of his father's resentment? Was there something he could have done to protect Marissa, to prevent the spiral that led to her death? The question of whether he could ever forgive Daniel weighed heavily on him. He had stood up in that courtroom, sworn to seek justice for Marissa, but he couldn't erase the fact that Daniel was his father. Despite the years of emotional distance, despite the betrayal, he still carried a vestige of love for the man who had raised him. How could he reconcile that with the brutal reality of the murder? Allison Blake, Marissa's sister, became his primary source of comfort. She, too, had lost someone she loved, someone she had shared a deep bond with. She understood the pain in a way few others did. They spent long hours talking, sharing memories of Marissa, trying to keep her spirit alive in their hearts. But even Allison knew that nothing could fully fill the void that Marissa's death had left. One evening, as they sat in silence on Allison's couch, Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then tossed it aside without looking at the screen. Allison noticed. "It's okay to not be okay, Evan," she said softly. "You don't have to fix everything right away." Evan nodded, but his mind wandered. He wondered if he would ever be able to move forward. The media would eventually tire of his story, and the protests would fade away. But he would remain with his grief, a grief that no amount of justice or public opinion could ever resolve. The months passed slowly. Evan avoided most of his friends, too weighed down by the sense of loss. He threw himself into work, trying to distract himself with the mundane. But his thoughts always returned to that one terrible day in the visiting room. One evening, as he walked past a local cafe where he and Marissa used to go for coffee, he stopped. The thought of sitting there without her felt unbearable, but he went in anyway. The barista recognized him. "Hey, Evan, right? I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for your loss," the young woman said, offering a sympathetic smile. Evan barely registered the words, but they lingered in his mind as he sat down. It wasn't much, a simple gesture, but it reminded him that life, in some form, still moved forward. Others still had a sense of normalcy. He was left to rebuild his own. Evan hadn't spoken to Daniel since the trial. Their relationship had shattered beyond repair, and the man who had once been his father was now an unrecognizable figure, a symbol of everything lost. The time would come when he would have to decide whether to visit Daniel in prison, but for now, he couldn't bring himself to face him. For now, Evan was just trying to survive the aftermath. He had no idea how long it would take to heal, or if he ever would. Months passed in a blur for Evan. The initial shock of the trial and the verdict gradually gave way to a crushing, unrelenting weight. The protests had died down, replaced by the dull hum of everyday life. But Evan's life felt permanently altered, frozen in time. He had no interest in returning to his old routine, his old self. Every morning, he woke up to the empty space beside him, the absence of Marissa louder than any noise in the world. The few friends he had left, those who hadn't drifted away in the wake of the trial, tried to offer comfort, but it felt hollow. They didn't understand. They couldn't. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows in his apartment, Evan found himself staring at the framed photos on the mantelpiece. There was one of Marissa laughing at a joke he had told her, her eyes sparkling with life, full of hope for the future. They had been so close to building something together, marriage, a home, a family. Now, it was all gone. He couldn't bring himself to put the photos away. He couldn't erase her from his life, but every time he looked at them, it hurt in ways he couldn't explain. Evan tried therapy for a while. It helped in small doses, but each session felt like a battle he was too exhausted to fight. His therapist suggested he write letters to Marissa, something to help process his grief, so he did. At first, the letters were cathartic. He wrote about everything, how much he missed her, how unfair it all felt, how much he hated his father for taking her away. But eventually, the writing became harder. The words didn't flow as easily, and the letters became more fragmented, more desperate. He began to lose faith in the process. Evan's emotional numbness only worsened as the months dragged on. He had trouble getting out of bed some days. The joy he once found in simple things like running errands or meeting friends for coffee had evaporated. He felt like a ghost, moving through life without truly participating in it. He hadn't seen his father since the trial, and he wasn't sure he ever could. The thought of facing him in person, of hearing his voice, was something Evan couldn't bring himself to endure. One afternoon, as winter began to creep in, Evan received an unexpected letter. It was from a reporter who had been covering the case since its inception. The reporter had gathered additional information about prison conditions at Greystone, specifically about the growing calls for reform and the conditions that allowed Daniel to carry out the murder. The letter made Evan pause. He hadn't given much thought to the prison system or the wider implications of the case after the verdict. His focus had been entirely on his own pain, his own struggle to survive the loss. But now, reading about the ongoing fallout, a strange new sense of purpose began to take root in him. He had a voice. Marissa's memory had to mean something more than just the tragedy of her death. The reporter asked Evan if he would be willing to give a public statement, something to further highlight the need for systemic change in the wake of his father's crime. It was a difficult decision, one Evan hadn't expected to make, but it felt like an opportunity to reclaim something from the wreckage of his life. He thought about it for a long time, weighing the emotional toll it would take. In the end, he made a choice. Marissa had wanted to change the world, even if in small ways. Maybe this was a way to honor that dream. The next week, Evan stood before a crowd of reporters and activists at a press conference, speaking about Marissa's life, about her passion for helping others, and about the need for real reform in the prison system. His voice was steady, his words thoughtful, but underneath it all, he felt hollow. He spoke for Marissa. He spoke for the world she had hoped to create. But the part of him that had once been full of hope and joy was gone, buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened. After the press conference, Evan felt drained, but a small part of him, just a tiny sliver, felt that maybe this could be the beginning of something. Maybe he could keep going, step by painful step. For the first time in months, he thought that healing might be possible, but he knew it would take time. And he knew, deep down, that Marissa's death would never stop haunting him. Months passed, and the world continued to turn despite the ruptures that had shattered Evan's life. The media had moved on, as it always did. New stories, new headlines, new tragedies to cover. But for Evan, it felt like nothing had changed. He still woke up each day with a feeling of heaviness in his chest, a knot of grief that had settled deep within him. His world was quieter now, but the silence was never peaceful. It was filled with memories of Marissa, memories of their future, and the cruel reality that she was gone. But Evan was learning, slowly, how to live with it. He continued to speak out for Marissa, using his public platform to talk about the issues surrounding the prison system, the failure of institutions like Greystone, and the need for broader societal changes. He met with advocacy groups and lawmakers, pressing for policies that would ensure such a tragedy could never happen again. He shared Marissa's story, her life, her dreams, and the beauty she brought into the world, hoping to inspire others to fight for justice, not just for her, but for the countless others who had fallen victim to a broken system. Evan spoke at rallies, attended meetings, and worked with organizations dedicated to reforming the criminal justice system. But it was always difficult. The pain of Marissa's absence weighed heavily on every step he took. Every victory, every small change he helped initiate, felt like it came at the cost of something far more precious. It was a painful reminder that, no matter how much he did, he could never bring her back. It took time, but Evan began to reconnect with friends he had pushed away during the trial, people who had tried to support him through the darkest moments. Slowly, the pieces of his life began to fit back together, though the picture was forever altered. He was no longer the same person he had been before Marissa's death. There was a fragility to him now, a part of him that would never heal. One evening, as he walked through a park near his apartment, Evan stopped to sit on a bench, staring out at the setting sun. The world around him seemed so unchanged, so indifferent to the horrors he had lived through. He thought about Marissa, about their plans, about the life they had hoped to build together. He could still hear her laugh in his memory, could still see her smile when he closed his eyes. It hurt, it always would. But in that moment, as he sat on the park bench, the weight of grief seemed a little less suffocating. He had come to accept that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. Healing was about finding a way to live alongside the grief, to carry it with him without letting it define him completely. Evan knew that moving forward didn't mean erasing the past. Marissa would always be a part of him, a part of everything he did. The love they shared, the hope they had for the future. It wasn't gone, it wasn't lost forever. It was now woven into the fabric of who he was. And that was something that no prison, no trial, no murder could ever take away. Evan stood up from the bench, his gaze lingering on the horizon. As he walked home, he thought about the work still to be done, the lives still to be changed, the memory of Marissa that would continue to fuel his efforts. He wasn't done yet. There was still so much more to do. And though he couldn't fix everything, though he couldn't bring her back, he could make sure her memory lived on in the work he did, in the lives he touched. Marissa's legacy was his to carry, and he would carry it for as long as he could.